Hey everybody, hope you're off to a great day. I'm certain that you've already seen the headlines about what's been described as an FBI raid of the personal residence of former President Trump. I have to admit, it makes me a little uncomfortable talking about this story at this particular point because so much of the reporting, really over the last, less than 24 hours at this point, has been based on reports or anonymous sources or people familiar with the matter. And as I look to give you a little bit of a backstory, a foundation for why a raid could potentially even happen here, a lot of those stories are also built upon people familiar with the matter, anonymous sources, and reports. So I want to go into our conversation today just acknowledging that, which is part of the problem with this story and why this story has become so controversial. So I'm going to take a big step back and talk to you a little bit about what has transpired over the last year and a half, really over the last 6 or 7 months, that could potentially be part of what's been described as an ongoing investigation into President Trump's personal records or his records from the presidency that actually belong to the public. So let's just talk a little bit about that. We don't have anything from the FBI, which is really, really critical. So we don't have a warrant. In order to get a warrant, you actually need to make an argument. Law enforcement needs to make an argument to a judge about why I'm going to be able to go into your house and look for something. That's part of the American justice system. So you have to have something for a judge to approve that. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go anywhere. Doesn't mean you're going to find something, but you have to make an argument to a judge to do that. Without knowing the warrant here, we're in a huge black hole in this story because we need to see the warrant. We need to understand, why would the Justice Department be doing this? And what specifically are they looking for? You're likely hearing a lot of accusations about political motivations. We're seeing Republicans who are allies of President Trump talk about the weaponization of the Justice Department. Let's just talk a little bit about why. This is unprecedented to see an investigation or multiple investigations of a former president. We've really never seen that before in modern times. I can't think of a time in history that we've seen it as well. That said, there's been a lot of unprecedented parts of the Trump presidency. I'm sure you can list off a few. January 6th is one of them as well. So we are in some uncharted territory here, seeing what we believe to be federal investigations. Again, ongoing investigations are fairly often not commented on. You're seeing congressional investigations that are led by Democrats. There you have the accusation of political motivations going after political opponents. They don't want President Trump to win. They don't want President Trump to gain power, Republicans say, so they're going to go after him. And then you have simply the presidential cycle. We know that the election cycle for the next presidential run is taking place. It's starting to ramp up. We're hearing murmurs that former President Trump could announce his run for the presidency. But these investigations that we're also hearing about are ongoing. And as the move towards the presidential cycle increases, and these investigations keep going, they're going to intersect at a certain point. And so if you have a Democrat in office and you have a Justice Department underneath a Democrat president, that's why those questions come up, which is, is this politically motivated to try to hurt a potential opponent of the Democrat Party? We also know we're a nation of laws, and if you break the law in America, you're held accountable. So we want to also remember that. We also want to remember that you're innocent until proven guilty. So a couple things just to keep in mind. So what's the backstory potentially to what happened with this FBI raid of the president's home? His son actually said something on the news within the last several hours, his son Eric Trump, that suggested this is related to the National Archives. So let's talk a little bit about that. At the beginning of the year, what we learned is that the National Archives had been in communication with President Trump and apparently his team for some items that were taken from the White House when he left the White House. Now, something that we should know is that the president's records, even what could potentially be considered as, for us, as personal records, my notes, for example, on this segment right here, those could be considered my personal records. these are my personal notes. But as president, these actually become public records, specifically and legally after I leave office. These records are collected by the National Archive. They're often placed in the presidential library. And the National Archive, in a lot of ways, makes some editorial judgment about what's important to include. They can get a whole bunch of different documents and things from the White House, and they're going to kind of go through and look at what is significant. We know from the National Archive that they had been in communication with President Trump over some boxes. You might have heard 15 boxes were removed from the Mar-a-Lago estate and sent back to the National Archives. In the reporting of this at the beginning of the year, it seemed that the Trump team was saying, well, we didn't really realize this is something that you needed. We thought these were personal records of the president. And admittedly, even though a lot of the reports right now are being described as, well, everyone knows that these are public records. Well, one of the things that we should recognize is that depending on what department of government you work in, what's classified, what's top secret changes. It's not all uniform as we think. The president has top national security access. He has personal effects and personal notes. And so there have been times in the past where there's been a question, or the National Archives in past presidencies have said, hey, can we get that? That's ours. Can we have that as a part of national records? This, in the amount of it, seemed to garner some attention and a question about whether or not President Trump may have taken things that he shouldn't have from the White House. This was compounded by some reporting by Maggie Haberman of the New York Times. She has a new book coming out just a couple weeks from now that's also bringing this back up into the news cycle, that she had confirmed, she says, according to her reporting, that President Trump repeatedly destroyed records while he was president, ripping up notes and flushing them down the toilet is actually what she is describing. The National Archive said that during the presidency, they were in contact with the president's team because they had heard that the president does like to rip up notes, and they talked to the White House counsel about that, saying, hey, we got to preserve, these are going to be public records, and so we're going to need to preserve that. How do I know all of this? I had to lean down and pick them up because I dropped them as I was getting excited talking to you. I actually have a note to the chairwoman of the Committee on Oversight and Reform in the House of Representatives, a New York Democrat, Carolyn Maloney. She's the chair. And this is a note from the archivist, the lead archivist in the National Archives. And basically, he had to answer a series of questions for Congress. Why did he have to do this? Well, according to the way that this timeline looks to kind of play out, when it became reported that the National Archive did have to get these boxes from Mar-a-Lago, the Democrats in Congress said, hey, wait a minute. Are you saying the president had information that he shouldn't have had and his personal estate? Like, we are starting an investigation into that. So a congressional investigation was announced and started into whether or not President Trump mishandled archives, personal records that should be public records, even classified information. The National Archive also confirmed that when they saw what was in the 15 boxes taken from Mar-a-Lago, they alerted the Justice Department because it was within their thinking, again, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, that there was some classified information that President Trump shouldn't have had in that capacity. Where that investigation has gone from here has been a big question. And I don't want to connect the dots on too many things, but remember, we do have a congressional investigation into what happened on January 6th. And there are some questions about potentially missing documents on that particular day within the White House. One of the questions that's been raised is whether or not in these boxes or in President Trump's, what he was thinking was personal records, is evidence that could be related to that investigation. Because we don't know the extent of the Justice Department investigation into January 6th, we're not quite sure if all these things sort of come together. But I'm just raising that because of the timing. We know the congressional investigation into January 6th is continuing. We're going to pick back up in the fall. We do know, without having total confirmation from the Justice Department via President Trump's son, that the National Archive was looking for more information. And that's why Eric Trump says they were present in Mar-a-Lago. So what is the law about what a president can keep and not keep? It's called the Presidential Records Act, and it really goes back to the late 1970s after Watergate. It went into effect in 1981, and it sort of put guidelines down on what a president should do when he leaves office. Some presidents just like took their stuff and left. And if you think about that, I mean, it was less than 100 years ago that it became something of a tradition that presidents would save their documents and have a presidential library and have all of these displayed, and the National Archive could be involved. So this hasn't been around forever. I have the Presidential Records Act in front of me, and I just want to read you a couple things that I think is important. So one of the things that the act did is it changed the legal ownership of the official records of the president from private to public. So instead of saying that's President Trump's letter between him and the leader of North Korea, which is one of the things that apparently was rumored to be in these boxes or something that he took from the White House, that's actually not his private correspondence. It belongs to the American people. And so it goes on to say that the public ownership of all presidential records and defines the term presidential records all goes to the National Archives. It places the responsibility for the custody and management of the incumbent presidential records with the president, which means that whoever's in office is responsible for sort of keeping their records together and then eventually handing them over, which is think about how many text messages you send a day. Think about the different correspondence that's coming in and out of that office. It's a lot. So this goes on to sort of establish, well, who gets to pull these records together? When do they get turned over to the National Archives? Which, by the way, that legal custody happens as soon as the president leaves office. So this could be potentially what this investigation is all about, or where it all came from, which is a question about records. But we don't really know that. And the one thing I want to say about this is that although this is something, a legislation, a law that Congress passed, there is a question about how legally binding it is. No one's been brought to court for violating the Presidential Records Act. Let me rephrase that. I shouldn't say brought to court. There was someone during the Clinton administration that hid some documents in his socks. We'll get into that later if we actually need to. But nothing really came of it. So the question is, like, if I violated the Presidential Records Act, let's say I just did it unknowingly. I kept a letter from a friend and I didn't think it was a matter of public records. Can I actually be tried and charged for that? Is that a criminal offense? We've never seen that before. Could it be? Sure. If someone mishandled classified information, could that be? Sure. But if the president himself is determining what's classified, what's not, what's personal, what's presidential, trying to hand this all over to the National Archives, it's a little bit chaotic. What would you have to prove to show that there was a crime of any sort? That's the big question. One historian described the Presidential Archives or the Presidential Records Act as more of a guideline, more of a guideline for presidents and their team rather than something that is legally binding and then enforceable. So this question about whether or not the Presidential Records Act could be at the heart of an FBI warrant seems a little bit of a stretch, but we don't know. We actually have no idea. And one of the things that I'm going to be really watching is, what does the White House say today? We're recording this just so we have some context. Is President Trump confirmed that this was taking place on the night of August 8th, in the evening of August 8th. We're talking the morning of August 9th. So anything can really happen from this point on. And I'm curious if we hear anything at all from the Department of Justice, anything at all from the White House. As there's less information, I would expect the accusations of political motivation and political weaponization of the Justice Department to increase, because in this cloud of mystery creates a lot of chaos. I thought this was interesting too. Andrew Yang was a presidential candidate. He was more of a libertarian, but he was trying to vie for the Democrat presidential nomination. Really interesting guy. I've interviewed him before. He's an entrepreneur. He thinks, has a tech background. He's kind of an innovator. But he says it actually will add momentum to the Republican Party, add momentum to President Trump's supporters, and really provide evidence for those that may be on the fence about whether or not there's a concerted effort by those in government to keep President Trump away from office and out of power, and anyone like him, anyone that thinks like him or allies like him. I think that's something interesting to think about today. And that's why I'll be curious to see if all of this talk and this energy actually moves the Justice Department, if they have anything to say about the investigation, to come out with some sort of information. Because it's the dangling of this could happen, you could be charged, you could be charged, you could be charged, you could be charged, that without a charge could start looking like a political weapon used by the Justice Department under the Democrat Party to try to keep a Republican out of office. So this is a little bit about what's happening here. Let me just review my notes real quick. I think we covered all the main points, but I'll say this. What I'm really looking forward to is anything on the record. We have President Trump's statement. We have, kind of a side comment by his son, Eric Trump, about what this is all about. We need more information. And with more information, we can get more specific, either on the Presidential Records Act, what's going on with the National Archives, whether or not this is tied somehow to investigation into January 6th, what's actually happening here. And right now, we are flying a little bit blind. So I want you to know that. Hope this is helpful regardless. At least you get a little bit of background about the Presidential Records Act, and, the fact that presidential libraries just weren't around forever. And we still don't know, President Trump, we don't know where his presidential library will be. And that's something that we'll be watching for, because that's where his records would live. So anything that happened in the White House that could be notable. And it's very cool. You can see, is it a special pen? Is it a special notebook? Did he wear a special tie on a certain day with a world leader? Some of those are collected to create a national story about what happened during the administration. And that national story is important for all of us, regardless of political party. So we'll be watching this very closely. If you have any questions and comments, please let me know, and I'll keep you updated as we hear more. Have a great day.